Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. For many gardeners in USDA Zones 7, 8, 9, and 10, March is the month for new beginnings. The weather is warmer, trees and shrubs are blooming, but wait a minute, it's still winter. Jack Frost can still be nipping at your plants, setting back the progress of new buds, flowers, and leaves. On today's Garden Basics, we have late winter and early spring frost protection tips for your new and established plants. Thinking of growing sweet potatoes? That's a good idea. Sweet potatoes are drought and heat tolerant, and they have very few pests or diseases. Sweet potatoes are low in calories, yet very nutritious, a good source of beta-carotene, protein, calcium, iron, vitamins A and C, and other minerals. And they can be stored longer than winter squash. But for a successful crop of this warm season favorite to grow, you need to get started now indoors. We revisit the information you need to grow sweet potatoes. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots. Let's go. Debbie Flower is here, our favorite retired college horticultural professor. Debbie, usually around October, November here in California, we start bracing ourselves for the first frost, and we get ready for it. What a lot of people get ticked off, though, are at spring frosts, and especially when it follows warm weather. Now, in California this year, it's dry. January, February, no rain. It was warm. So things started busting out early as far as flowers go on.
Yes, and we were happy. Trees. It was green and there were flowers and birds are singing. And
yeah, it's spring.
Yeah, it's lovely.
But it's February.
Right. I've lived in California since 1990, so that's 30 plus years. We have always had a warm spell in February. In fact, some Februaries we can have a 90-degree days.
Yes.
So, yes, we always get fooled.
Right. And when that happens, people forget. They go, well, the plant made it this far, so it'll be okay. And usually, especially with spring frosts and new growth, the plants can take the first frost, but it's the second or third punch. When you get 2 or 3 days in a row of temperatures at 32 degrees or below, that can cause damage. So we get an email question from Tanya, who emails us at fred@farmerfred.com. And Tanya writes in and says, I have put frost cloth around over my most vulnerable plants, mostly succulents. I have C9 lights on some of them. C9 lights are the old Christmas light, and those are the warm light bulbs. With so many nights of frost and me leaving for work at 7 a.m., do I have to remove the frost cloth every morning? Or should I switch my work schedule to come in later?
Wow.
Try that one, Tanya. Yeah.
She's a dedicated gardener.
See how that flies. How much harm will it do my plants, again, mostly succulents, to have the frost cloth on them all day? Yeah, that's the other thing about us getting frosts late winter, early spring, is they're usually followed by daytime temps in the 60s or 70s.
It warms up nicely into plant growing temperatures. Yeah.
So covering succulents, good idea. You know what isn't a good idea when a spring frost is predicted if you have succulents is you probably shouldn't water your succulents.
Absolutely.
It's a case of, well, those roots don't need to be hydrated with something that might freeze.
Yes, and succulents are a category of plants named such because they get very full of water. They have the ability to store water, and so they'll suck up all kinds of water when it's available, put it inside of their stems, their leaves, whatever. It varies from succulent to succulent. And then if we do get very cold, especially 28 degrees or below, which is the temperature at which an actively growing plant cell will freeze. If those succulents are full of water and we hit those temperatures, the cells can freeze and burst because ice is bigger than water. And so they the cells can't stretch that much, and so the cells burst, and you have what looks like frozen lettuce. If you've ever frozen your lettuce in your refrigerator, they just turn to mush, and that the plant's gone then, or that portion of the plant is dead.
Now, it is true that if a frost is forecast for many of your other container plants that aren't succulents, yeah, the soil should be moist because that can stave off damage. A wet soil is a warmer soil.
Right. Water can only flow if it's 32 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer. So when you're applying it, it is at least 32 degrees Fahrenheit. If you can put it on in the morning and it goes through those 60-degree midday temperatures, that water will absorb some of that heat, and that heat then is given off at night and can help protect the plant. If you cover it with a frost cloth or a sheet, something very lightweight over the plant, and you drape that all the way to the ground.
Yeah.
Over the pot, around the pot, and all the way to the ground.
On the outer perimeter of the plant.
On the outer perimeter of the plant, not in the container, outside of it, on the ground. Then any heat that's emitted from the soil below the pot, from the pot, or if the plant is just in the ground, from the soil below, will be trapped underneath that cloth, the frost cloth or the sheet. And that can raise the temperature just enough to protect your plant.
Yeah, I see so many people preparing for a frost or a freeze by taking that frost cloth or that sheet and wrapping it tightly around the top of the canopy and tying it to the trunk, creating a lollipop. And there's no way that
won't do it.
Warmth can penetrate that.
They even sell products. They sell frost cloth made like lollipops, or like the top of the lollipop, and you put it over the plant. And I've seen pictures where they then yank it tight at the trunk above the soil. That's not the goal of covering the plant. The goal is to include the soil beneath the plant, because that's where there's much more heat trapped that will be given off at night as the temperature drops lower, and that can help protect your plant.
Since the name of the show is Garden Basics, here's a basic question. What is a frost cloth?
Right. Frost cloth is special fabric. It's spun fabric, not woven. Woven fabric, you can see the lines of threads going two directions. In a spun fabric, it doesn't look that way. If you're a sewer and you use interfacing, it looks like interfacing. It's typically white. I've never seen it any other color. It comes in...
I have a green sheet. If
do
you'd
you
like
have
to
a
see
green
it.
sheet?
Yes.
A green
frost cloth.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh my, am I not getting out enough?
Yeah.
So it comes in different weights. When it's really, really, really thin, we use it as a row cover. And that's not a frost cloth. It's not thick enough to trap the heat, and it also allows water and light through it. But they make thicker ones. Sometimes they call them frost blankets, I believe. And they don't let so much light in. They do let some air transfer happen, but they hold the heat better than a very thin fabric would.
So a frost cloth is permeable. It does allow air and water to go through.
Yes.
And light. The sheet, the problem with using bed sheets to protect a plant, I think, is if it gets wet. If it rains and you have that on your plant, you could be breaking branches.
Yes, and I've been a gardener all my life, even through the times when I had no money. And bed sheets were it for me. And boy, was that a chore to get up in the morning and go move those. Because often when you get that cold, there's often dew. Whether it rained or not, there's dew. So there's water dropping out of the air, and it's absorbed by that lovely cotton bed sheet that I then have to drag away for the day and then put it back on in the night to go through the next cold night.
But as you mentioned, if you can put that frost cloth over your plant earlier in the day to allow the heat of the day to warm up things underneath there, that is another degree of protection for that plant.
Well, I would want to put the frost cloth on just as the sun is going down.
Oh, would you?
Yes,
Okay.
because I want the sun to warm up the moist media underneath the plant, whether that's container media or regular field soil. And then that allows the maximum heat to get to that soil, and hopefully it's wet soil, moist, not dripping. You don't want to overwater, but to that moist soil, because water holds heat much better than air holds heat. So you got water, it's going to absorb more heat. Then as the sun goes down, temperatures are just going to drop after that. So cover it right as after the sun goes down or as the sun is going down, and take it off at your first opportunity in the morning. If, however, you go to work, it's a bad morning, what the cat threw up or whatever. You found a stain on got all dressed for work and found a stain in your clothes, whatever. Run in your stocking. That used to be a problem. I don't know if people will still wear stockings to work. I don't think that
happens anymore.
Yeah, well, that used to be a problem. And the story when you got to work was it happened on the way in. But anyway, if you get delayed...
You snagged it on the horse trolley.
You snagged it on the bus ride on the way in. Anyway, if you forget and you don't take it off one day, don't stress about it. The plants will be fine. It'll just be like a super shady day for them. Try to take it off the next day. You don't want to put the frost cloth on and leave it for, let's say, a week. You want to take it off every day if possible. But if you mess up and forget one day, that's okay. Don't stress about it.
Heavens knows I've seen enough people with marginal plants in my neighborhood who have covered these plants all the time. Like ficus, the fig plant, like a weeping fig or a ficus benjamina.
Which is really a tropical or subtropical
plant. Exactly.
Plant.
But they're zone extenders, if you will, these people.
Okay,
these are gardeners who are zone extenders. They're trying to, grow things that remind them of their youth from where they used to live.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to protect that plant through the winter, they'll just cover it with a frost cloth and leave it either on their front porch or put it in the garage. What happens when you cover a plant like that consistently all the time?
Well, it doesn't get any light, so it's not going to do any growth. It'll just sit still.
I would think the leaves would die.
Well, yeah, they'll be getting a minimal amount of light. If, let's say, they're outside with frost cloths on top of them, they'll get a minimal amount of light. Ficuses, figs, weeping figs, or rubber trees are often grown indoors. And indoors is like a cave to a plant. We can see indoors because our eyes have pupils that get bigger and allow more light in when we are in a darker space. Plants don't react that way. They need a certain amount of light to grow. And if they don't get it, they are just in a slow decline. So those plants that are put in the garage for the winter are just in a slow decline. And it's like interior scaping. You go into the major shopping mall, if anybody does that anymore, and there are indoor plants. There are plants inside the major shopping mall, and they're not getting very much light. Even if there are skylights way above them, they're not getting very much light. And so those plants are in slow decline. I had an interior scaper tell me that. Their goal when you put plants indoors is to slow down their death.
So we should outlaw houseplants.
No. Oh, okay. It's amazing how they will grow if you put them in sun, and they need to be very close to windows. I have skylights in my bathroom, and I have plants on the shelf over the top of the shower. Not a very easy place to water, but they are doing fine. They can acclimate and grow at the slower rate that light level allows, but then you also need to change the way you care for them to match that. So you don't want to water them as often as you would if they got bright light, or fertilize them as often as you would if they got bright light.
That's a very good point about houseplants, is their need for fertilizer is much less, being that there's very little light.
Yes, right.
Because what happens when you feed a houseplant fertilizer in a low light situation?
It doesn't get used, so it builds up. Sometimes you'll see the white crusties if you're in an unsealed ceramic pot. Those are salts. Fertilizers have to be in the salt form for the plant to be able to absorb it. So fertilizers that are quick acting are in the salt form. Those that are slow acting have to be converted to the salt form by microorganisms. And so eventually you've got a bunch of salt in the soil. And if you don't leach it out, which would mean flushing the soil with excess water, clear water, then it builds up in the soil, and that leads to a tying up of nutrients that the plant does need to use. And it can kill the plant.
But Tanya, really, I would like you to ask your boss if you could switch your hours around so you could come in later and see what his reply would be. I would think in this...
Now, maybe the boss is a her.
Maybe a boss is a her. Either way, good luck on that. But in this age of COVID, bosses are much more flexible.
They are. They're just happy to have people.
Yes.
It's not just COVID. It's the big quit.
Yeah. Exactly. And yeah, you could, mention that you might have to quit to take care of your plants.
Take care of your plants. This is a woman after my own heart. She knows her priorities are plants.
There you go. All right. But Tanya, yeah, as long as you use a frost cloth and it's not a heavy sheet, a bedspread or anything like that. And I've seen that on plants too for frost protection. And I guess that's okay in the short term.
Right. It tends to crush the plant.
Yes.
But in the short term, it's better than nothing.
You want that lightweight, permeable interfacing, I believe you called it.
I did spun fabric.
Spun fabric.
Yes.
There you go. Frost cloth. And they sell it in various weights. It's widely available. So keep that handy, and we'll get through fall frost, winter frost, and spring frost together.
Yeah.
With that, thank you, Tanya, for your question. Debbie Flower, thank you for a good answer.
You're welcome, Fred.
You've heard me talk about the benefits of Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric container. Smart Pots are sold around the world and are proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Many of the imitators are selling cheaply made fabric pots that fall apart quickly. Not Smart Pots. There are satisfied Smart Pot owners who have been using the same Smart Pots for over a decade, actually approaching 20 years. When you choose Smart Pot fabric containers, you know you'll be having a superior growing experience with the best product on the market. And your plants will appreciate Smart Pots too. Because of the 1 million microscopic holes in Smart Pots, your soil will have better drainage and the roots will be healthier. They won't be going round and round on the outside of the soil ball like you see in so many plastic pots. The air pruning qualities of Smart Pots creates more branching of the roots, filling more of the usable soil in the Smart Pot. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers and select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. Got a question recently from a listener who was wondering about growing sweet potatoes. This listener says, I'm hoping you might address the subject of growing sweet potatoes. This person says, any experience you might have with varieties or tips would be appreciated. It's been very frustrating with a low success rate. As a San Joaquin master gardener in Lodi, I have access to resources to help with these crops. Any experience you might have with varieties or tips would be appreciated. Buying organic sweet potatoes and starting the slip growing process in January has been frustrating with a low success rate. They are in my house, which isn't very warm in winter. Well, when it comes to vegetables, we like to bring in our resident vegetable expert, Sacramento County Master Gardener Gail Pothauer. And Gail, sweet potatoes, they really like the heat, don't they?
Oh, they do, and they're warm. So you get them in too early and you'll have problems. So you need to wait, get them in the ground when it's like mid-May here in the Sacramento Valley.
In one regards, I understand this person's frustration because at a lot of nurseries, sweet potatoes are available usually in late winter, and that's not the time to be planting them. And so it's a case of having to keep those sweet potatoes someplace cool and dry until the weather warms up.
Right, cool and dry, but not too cool because they are sensitive to temperatures below 50 degrees. So if you store them in say in a garage or in a shed during the winter, that could be too cold for them. So one of the best ways to get these slips, and sweet potatoes are grown from slips, not the actual potato, is to get them from a disease-free certified mail order place or a nursery. Sometimes local nurseries will carry the slips, not often. Mail order catalogs will have them listed, but one of the main problems is most southern grown slips cannot be shipped to California because there's a quarantine for the sweet potato weevil. So it can be difficult to find slips that you can order, but you can also grow them yourself if you have, say, an organically grown sweet potato that you've been able to hold over during the winter. there is a process to grow out the slips yourself.
Is there a chance of picking up a disease that way, though? Or should you actually buy the sweet potatoes fresh, seed potatoes fresh every year?
Well, there is a chance to have diseases that are passed along because the slips are, since they're grown vegetatively, you grow them from a slip that comes off of the sweet potato, it is possible to transfer diseases, particularly viruses and things like that. So I think if you're careful, we always recommend you get them from a certified mail order, grower. But if you do it yourself, if you get an organically grown sweet potato at a farmer's market, and there hasn't been any kind of a sprout inhibitor put on it, then you can try it yourself. It can be a little bit of a challenge, but it's kind of like the science experiment we did in high school. There is a way that you can grow them. And we do have one of our Sacramento County Master Gardener publications does have information about growing slips yourself.
It is. It's a very handy publication called Growing Sweet Potatoes in the Sacramento Region, and you can do an internet search for that just by using that phrase, Growing Sweet Potatoes in the Sacramento Region. If you add the letters UCANR after it, it'll pop right up. UCANR stands for the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources. And there's a lot of great information there. And in the case of this particular person, I think they just started a little too early.
Oh, I agree. They said that they had started them in January, and that's way too early because at least in our area, in order for the soil to be warm enough and the air temperature to be warm enough, we'll plant them in the garden in May. So you would start the slips yourself 2 months before that, so March. So January is a little bit early. And this person also said that their home wasn't very warm in the winter. And in order to grow out sweet potato slips, they need to be kept quite warm. So the way you would do it is to have small sweet potatoes, put them in a shallow container, cover them a couple of inches with sand or peat moss or some material, sawdust even, keep it moist and warm. So you would ideally put the container on, say, a propagation mat, a heating mat, to keep the medium warm, 75 to 80 degrees. So that's what they need. If it's too early and too cold, they won't have very good success.
But again, you have the conundrum of sweet potatoes being available at the nursery way too early, for planting. So you buy them in winter, but hold on to them and don't start the slips until, like you said, when the weather warms up.
Right. And unlike the regular potato, the russet, the Irish potato that we normally associate with growing in the ground, you put that potato in the ground and that's what sprouts. Sweet potatoes, you don't plant the sweet potato. You do need to get slips growing from that potato, and then you would snap those off and plant the slip in the ground.
Okay. Then what is the process for doing that?
Well, that's, as I mentioned, you would put the sweet potato in a shallow container, cover it medium, keep it warm. The slips would grow, and when they're about 8 inches long, you just snap those off and then just stick that in the ground, and then roots will form from that slip.
Sweet potatoes have a large growing area. They can be grown in many areas of California. So what sort of fertilization and watering do sweet potatoes need?
Well, they need to have a fertile soil. It needs to be pretty sandy and well draining. They tend to not do real well in, say, a heavy clay soil because when you harvest the sweet potatoes, it can get scarred up and things like that. But as far as fertilization, you don't want high nitrogen because then you'll get a lot of foliage and not so much flowering and the little sweet potatoes. So what we like to do at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center when we grow sweet potatoes is give them a monthly application of something like fish emulsion that's been diluted. Nothing too high in nitrogen.
When are sweet potatoes ready to harvest?
Yeah, many varieties are available after 90 to 140 days. So depending on the variety that you're growing, you would start checking in the soil around that time. So if you were growing a 100-day variety, after 100 days, kind of check around and see what size the little sweet potatoes are. But generally, it's going to be later in the summer, even early fall, because it is a long growing season.
Will the vines turn yellow first before they're ready?
Generally, they will. That's one of the signs that they're getting ready to harvest, is the sign will start to yellow. So if the vines have not started to naturally turn yellow, but it's starting to become cold weather. Remember, I said they're sensitive to temperatures at 50 degrees or below. Then you might want to just harvest them before the cold weather, because that would really damage the sweet potatoes.
All right, so pay attention to those nighttime temperatures, and when the forecast starts calling for nighttime temperatures or early morning temperatures to be below 50 degrees, get out your shovel or spading fork and start harvesting.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah, because they will be damaged, even if just a few hours at below 50 degrees.
How do you store sweet potatoes?
Good question. Sweet potatoes do need to be cured before they're stored. Otherwise, they will decay in storage. And it's kind of tricky of finding ways to cure sweet potatoes, because commercially, the growers do have curing rooms with heaters and humidifiers and evaporative coolers to maintain all the proper temperature and humidity. Well, that isn't something that home gardeners really have access to. So actually, in the publication that I mentioned earlier about growing sweet potatoes in Sacramento area, there is a list of ways that home gardeners can try to cure the sweet potatoes without having all that fancy equipment. The thing is, you want to keep it warm and humid. So it's kind of hard, at least in our area, to have warm weather that's humid, because we don't have a lot of humidity here. But there are things like storing them in a warm area, a greenhouse or something, with a pail of water and covering them with plastic to keep the humidity in. So things like that. But you do need to cure them for several weeks in order for them to store properly. And another way to cure sweet potatoes, as I say, it can be rather daunting to have the right equipment, is that you could set up a heater in a small room or in a pantry and have the temperature about 85 degrees, and then have a bucket of water that you would place in that room to kind of keep the humidity up, and put the sweet potato roots that you've harvested in boxes, have them well ventilated, so in a single layer, and place that box on a table or something above the heater, so that you have the warmth and the humidity, and that would help with the curing process, and it may take a week or so. However, just be careful if you're using a heater around anything that's flammable, that you want to take precautions so that you don't have the heater get overheated and could cause a fire. After you cure them, you'd want to store them in a room that's about 60 degrees. And so, what's the coolest place in your house? Maybe wrap them in newspaper, put them in a box under your bed kind of thing, or in an unused closet. But that's kind of one of the challenges of growing sweet potatoes, is the curing process and then storage process. Now, if you don't plan on storing the sweet potatoes for very long, you could certainly eat them, and that's fine. But just be aware that newly harvested sweet potatoes aren't going to be very sweet. They need that curing process, or at least a storage time, when the carbohydrates turns to sugar. So that makes the sweet potato a little bit more palatable. So you can certainly eat them right after they're harvested, but they won't have that real sweet flavor that's what we expect.
Yeah, and I guess storing the roots in rooms that are warmer than 65 degrees could cause those roots to sprout.
Right. So that's another problem, is if it's too warm, then they can sprout. So it's finding that optimum about 60 degrees in a dark place, in a box under your bed, maybe.
One thing we haven't talked about in this discussion of sweet potato tips is a sweet potato the same thing as a yam?
No, it is not. That's a marketing ploy. Actually, the true yam is from Africa. It's a completely different family, not related at all to the sweet potato. And they can get huge. They can get 3 feet long and weigh 30 and 40 pounds. So you don't find true yams grown here in the U.S. I've never actually seen one. It was back in the mid 20th century that farmers in Louisiana decided they wanted to differentiate their orange flesh sweet potatoes that are a little moister than some of the white ones that are a little drier. They wanted to differentiate them from those drier sweet potatoes. So they started calling them yams. So it was just simply a marketing ploy. So in California, I don't know about other states, but if it's labeled as a yam, they have to also tell you it's a sweet potato. So all sweet potatoes are sweet potatoes. There's no true yam that's grown here in the U.S. Also, I failed to mention that the leaves on sweet potatoes are edible as well. I mentioned it about okra, but I think I forgot to mention it on the sweet potatoes.
Well, you just did.
But it's that the sweet potato leaves can be used like spinach or chard.
I would eat them raw. Can you eat the sweet potato leaves raw?
So sweet potato leaves can be eaten raw, although they kind of have a slight bitterness apparently when they're raw. When they're cooked, they become a little more mild and delicate flavored. And I have not actually eaten sweet potato leaves raw myself, but according to one of the websites that I got on, Specialty Produce, they were talking about it and said that it's very similar in taste to spinach. It can be a little bitter when raw. So if you use it in a salad, it's perfectly edible, but it might impart a little bitter flavor. Cooking it would mellow that out.
We've learned a lot today about growing sweet potatoes. Gail Pothauer, Sacramento County Master Gardener, thanks for your help on this.
My pleasure, Fred.
Have you taken a look at the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred Beyond the Basics newsletter yet? It's a deep dive into what was discussed on the podcast, along with more great gardening information. It really is going beyond the basics. In the edition of the newsletter coming out Friday, March 4th, we complete our trilogy of newsletters exploring the topic, what the heck are you going to plant this year? 2 weeks ago, we reported on award-winning pepper varieties. Last Friday, it was all about tomato varieties that deserve a place in your garden. And on the edition that comes out Friday, March 4th, we're talking about a mix of All-America Selections winners, including chard, eggplant, kale, lettuce, melons, okra, and zucchini. You heard about these plants in episodes 168 and 169 in the Garden Basics podcast. Now you can read even more about them. We have thorough descriptions, pictures, and links to this combination of tasty vegetables. It's in the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter, Beyond the Basics. Find a link in the podcast show notes or at farmerfred.com or by going to substack.com/gardenbasics. Think of it as your garden resource that goes beyond the basics. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter, and it's free. Please subscribe and share it with your gardening friends and family. The Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter, Beyond the Basics. And thank you for listening. Garden Basics comes out every Tuesday and Friday. It's brought to you by Smart Pots. Garden Basics is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes Apple, iHeart, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, Google, Podcast Addict, CastBox, and Pocket Casts. Thank you for listening, subscribing, and leaving comments. We appreciate it.